Regulaciones Norteamericanas.
Good morning. Thank you for having me here today. I want to build upon a couple of the themes that were mentioned in the last presentation, competitiveness and good corporate governance, because those two themes are really changing the way the United States and our state governments think about intellectual property and its broader role in promoting a strong U.S. economy. In the U.S., as I'm sure is true in Peru, job growth and economic growth is the top priority for U.S. policymakers. And the three pillars of our economic growth strategy are exports, manufacturing, and innovation. And when we think about each of those objectives, increasing U.S. exports, creating a strong manufacturing base in the United States, and promoting strong innovation, it takes us to this issue of intellectual property and the role that intellectual property plays in the United States in accomplishing each of these economic goals, but also the negative effects of intellectual property theft on our ability to drive exports, to maintain a fair competitive environment for our manufacturers, and to promote innovation. And so as we think about these broader objectives and the important role of intellectual property in the U.S. economy, there's a growing consensus that when companies steal intellectual property, when they steal software or other forms of information technology, they create an unfair business advantage that makes it harder for honest manufacturers, for honest businesses to compete. And again, it goes back to this issue of good corporate governance. When companies allow unethical practices to exist within their business, they are creating an unfair competitive advantage that harms competition more broadly. And so in the U.S., this is a growing consensus that intellectual property theft not only hurts the owner of the intellectual property, it also hurts the companies that pay for the intellectual property they use, whether software or other forms of IP. And again, increasingly there's an effort to underscore the importance of maintaining strong intellectual property commitments within businesses, within supply chains, to ensure a fair, competitive playing field for U.S. manufacturers and for U.S. companies more broadly. And so just to talk a little bit about some of the trends that are driving this emphasis on intellectual property as a fundamental pillar of good corporate governance. We've seen over the last decade a significant decline in U.S. manufacturing in the U.S. And that's not only true of traditional manufacturing sectors like apparel or steel or what have you, it's also impacting what we consider to be IP-intensive manufacturing sectors like solar, advanced batteries, clean energy. And we're seeing in the U.S., even in the manufacturing spaces where we should be very successful because of our strong base of intellectual property and innovation, we're losing our manufacturing jobs to emerging markets like China and elsewhere, where the rule of law is not as strong and commitments to ethical business practices are not as strong. And when we lose manufacturing jobs, we lose innovation. There's a significant body of economic research that shows that when manufacturing jobs go overseas, R&D follows, skilled labor follows, the know-how that is so essential to driving those manufacturing sectors also goes overseas. And we've seen this in the semiconductor industry. Virtually all semiconductor manufacturing now takes place in Asia. We have really no U.S. manufacturing capabilities in the semiconductor space anymore. And not only have we lost the manufacturing jobs, we've lost the innovation that accompanies those manufacturing jobs. And so the question then is there a correlation between the loss of manufacturing, the loss of innovation, and ethical business practices that are important to promote a strong, fair, competitive environment? And we see, as we look at this chart, which compares countries with a weak rule of law and countries with high rates of piracy, that in that sort of top right quadrant, there are a large number of emerging markets where U.S. manufacturing jobs are increasingly flowing, where we're seeing very high rates of intellectual property theft. And so again, there's this correlation between a loss of manufacturing jobs to markets where a weak rule of law and weak corporate governance allows intellectual property theft to continue with virtually no sanction or penalty. And so, of course, intellectual property theft impacts the owners of the intellectual property. And we've seen this in the software industry for many, many years, where each year the Business Software Alliance conducts a study of economic losses and job losses attributable to software theft. And globally, the losses are in the hundreds of billions of dollars. One of the studies showed that even a 10% reduction in software theft could lead to as many as 500,000 jobs worldwide. In the manufacturing sector, we've lost over 2 million manufacturing jobs in the last 3 years, due in part to unethical business practices like software theft. And so, again, there is this growing awareness that software theft is one of the very harmful, unfair business practices that has made it hard for the U.S. economy to maintain a manufacturing base. It makes it hard for us to drive exports, particularly exports of legitimate intellectual property products throughout the world, and makes it hard to secure our innovation base and our IP base at home. And ultimately, the most significant, profound loss are to U.S. consumers who lose jobs. And so the question then is, well, why does IT theft matter to manufacturers? It's clearly we understand why intellectual property theft matters to software producers or movie producers, but why does it matter to manufacturers? And the reason that is that increasingly information technology costs, including software, account for a growing percentage of manufacturers' overall costs. To stay competitive in today's environment, manufacturers increasingly invest in information technology to be more productive, to be more competitive, to be more efficient. And particularly when you look at the percentage of information technology costs against profits, manufacturers invest, IT costs represent the greatest investment for manufacturers vis-a-vis their profits. In other words, in the manufacturing sector, you see very thin profit margins. And so investments in information technology matter. They are a very significant cost, and when their competitors steal the information technology they use, there is a clear competitive disadvantage that results. And I think increasingly manufacturers share this view as well. They understand that when they invest $10 million, $15 million in information technology, and they're competing with a manufacturer that has the same technology at none of the costs, that there's a very clear competitive harm that results. And it not only impacts their ability to maintain profitability and competitiveness in a very tough environment, but it also distorts the playing field for all competitors. And that's true in Peru as in any country with an important manufacturing base. We had a consulting firm do a brief analysis to try to understand the financial disadvantages to manufacturers in Peru that pay for the software they use. And annually it's about $36 million in costs that they are forced to bear that their competitors are not forced to bear. And again, when you think about the very tough economic climate in which manufacturers operate, that kind of disparity can create real problems in terms of maintaining competitiveness in the local economy. So increasingly, U.S. policymakers are looking at global supply chains and thinking about how can we ensure a more fair, competitive environment for our manufacturers? How can we create a climate that allows manufacturing jobs to stay in the United States, that promotes exports, and that ultimately promotes innovation? And again, there's a growing emphasis on legal use of software and other forms of intellectual property as being a fundamental ethical business practice that all suppliers should adhere to. And the graph here shows the destination for Peruvian markets, the United States being the top export market for Peru, China being the second most important market. And the point here is that not only is this an important issue for U.S. manufacturers, it's an important issue for manufacturers in Peru as well. When companies in Colombia or Chile or China or what have you use stolen information technology, and sometimes that usage is 99% of their software being stolen, there is a clear disadvantage for Peruvian manufacturers that pay for the software they use. So this competitive harm impacts all honest manufacturers, whether they're based in the US or Peru or other markets. And as in the United States, exports are increasingly important to Peru's economic growth. So when I talked about the three pillars of US economic growth being exports, manufacturing, innovation, I would imagine that those same pillars exist in Peru as well. And so when we talk about intellectual property as being an important cornerstone of ethical supply chain practices, that's true for manufacturers in Peru as well as for manufacturers in the US. It is a shared value that that all companies should aspire to, no matter where they're based. And so in the United States, we're increasingly seeing our top policymakers, both at the federal and the state level, starting to focus on intellectual property and lawful use of IT as an important driver of fair competition, of exports, of manufacturing and innovation. And in his State of the Union address, President Obama noted the inequity that results when companies, or countries rather, steal our intellectual property and in response has created an interagency trade enforcement unit to try to develop harmonized federal policies and responses to this problem. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton also noted the importance of this issue in maintaining healthy global supply chains that promote fair competition, and she specifically focused on pirated software as being an unethical business practice that creates an unfair environment for companies that play by the rules. The states have been particularly aggressive in recognizing the competitive harm that results when manufacturers in emerging markets or elsewhere use large quantities of stolen IT. And 36 state attorneys general sent a letter to the Federal Trade Commission asking the FTC to take action under our federal unfair competition laws. And they specifically noted the importance of maintaining a strong manufacturing sector in their state as a means of driving sustainable job growth. And they called out the use of stolen IT by competitors as one of the kinds of unfair business practices that is making it increasingly hard for U.S. manufacturers to remain competitive. In Washington State and Louisiana, laws have been passed that explicitly create a cause of action when manufacturers steal information technology, whether software or other forms of technology, to gain an unfair competitive advantage. In Washington State, the new law allows both the Attorney General and injured competitors to bring a cause of action against manufacturers that steal IT. And the potential remedy is not only damages, but injunctive relief that potentially prohibits manufacturers from selling products in Washington State. So again, it's a recognition that IP theft not only harms the owner of the IP, but creates this unfair competitive advantage that should be addressed through market access type remedies. And so the idea is if you steal IT to gain an unfair competitive advantage against manufacturers in Washington, you will not be permitted to sell your products in the state of Washington. And then importantly, it also creates potential liability for companies that do business with those manufacturers. So, for example, if a large U.S. retailer or a large U.S. manufacturer sources products to a manufacturer in Colombia or Vietnam or any other country, and that manufacturer steals IT, there's potential liability for the customer doing business with that manufacturer. However, that liability is limited through what we call safe harbors that give customers an opportunity to avoid liability by trying to enforce good supply chain practices with their suppliers. So the question then is, what should you do as a manufacturer to avoid these kind of growing responses by U.S. and state and federal lawmakers in the U.S.? What should companies do that do business with manufacturers that potentially use stolen software or other forms of IP in their supply chains? And for manufacturers, the answer is simple. You get legal. You implement the same kinds of responsible practices that apply to all forms of good corporate governance. You conduct an inventory of the software you're using. You legalize any software that's not covered by a valid license. And then you implement software asset management procedures and controls to ensure that you stay legal. Again, these are the same sort of standard practices that address all forms of business ethical practices. And for companies that source with manufacturers, there's a real opportunity for U.S. companies and companies throughout the world to promote legal software use through their supply chain contracts, codes of conduct. Most large U.S. manufacturers and retailers today have codes of conduct that require their suppliers to adhere to certain ethical business standards. And those codes of conduct are a very important vehicle in terms of incentivizing manufacturers and suppliers to use lawful software and other lawful IP. There are a number of tools that are available to help manufacturers get legal. We've listed here just a few, but the Business Software Alliance, which has been active in Peru for many, many years, actually certifies IT professionals to help companies develop software asset management programs and conduct inventories. The ICC and BASC have IP guidelines for businesses that, again, help develop a framework of asset management programs with respect to use of lawful IT. There are industries that have developed codes of conduct that address not only lawful use of intellectual property, but all ethical business practices. The electronics industry Citizenship Coalition being one of them. Its members include most large electronics companies, IT companies. And then there are a number of international standards and certification programs that have developed through ISO and other international bodies. But again, they all promote practices that require companies to understand the kind of software and information technology they're using, to ensure that that use is legal, and to develop programs that allow those companies to maintain a legal environment moving forward. And so obviously there are many benefits to maintaining a compliant environment, but I want to emphasize the last in terms of enhancing your global reputation. One of the, I think, key points to take away from what's happening in the U.S. with these state laws and federal initiatives is that, clearly there's an incentive, a growing incentive on manufacturers throughout the world to adhere to the laws with respect to their use of intellectual property and information technology. But more importantly, there's an opportunity for companies to differentiate themselves vis-a-vis companies that don't adhere to ethical standards. Retailers, manufacturers, companies that source with manufacturers throughout the world, they do care about ethical business standards within their supply chains. And so one way for a Peruvian company to differentiate itself from a Colombian company or Chilean company is to demonstrate to its customers that they maintain ethical business practices throughout their organization, both with respect to labor, environmental, but also with respect to their use of information technology and other forms of intellectual property. And so there's a real opportunity to benefit from these, from this sort of growing emphasis on lawful use of intellectual property as well. It can become a competitive differentiator as well as an incentive to legalize business practices within the company. That's it. Thank you very much.